We have a fantastic set of talks now set up for you from our next two speakers who will be describing real-world impacts of CBK in learning health systems, I think for more of their commercial space, commercial orientation and perspectives. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce our next two speakers. First, we'll be hearing from Dr. Tonya Hongsermeier, who is the Vice President and Chief Clinical Information Officer for Alimu Informatics based out of San Diego, California, which specializes in healthcare interoperability, data quality, and clinical decision support solutions. Dr. Hongsermeier is internationally recognized and has held prior senior informatics leadership roles in institutions including Partners Healthcare, where she led the development of a groundbreaking knowledge management team to implement leading-edge tools and governance structures to embed clinician-friendly clinical decision support into EHRs. In Beth Israel Lahey Health, where she supported the migration of 6 hospitals and 300 outpatient departments to an integrated EHR platform, ultimately achieving system-wide HIM Stage 7 maturity. More recently, Tonya leads efforts that have implemented collaboration in content management systems, served as team lead on the ARC-funded Clinical Decision Support Consortium and the Healthy Decisions Initiative, which led to the development of a standard digital model for reporting quality measures. Her focus remains on ensuring that caregivers and patients have access to the best knowledge solutions possible for achieving health connection and wellness. And then next we'll hear from Dr. Brian Alper, who is the CEO of Computable Publishing, president of the Scientific Knowledge Accelerator Foundation, and project lead for EBM on Fire and the Health Evidence Knowledge Accelerator. Founder of the clinical reference tool Dynamed, Dr. Alper is now leading efforts that enable standards-based computable healthcare and scientific knowledge, especially related to healthcare and scientific evidence. Through his company, Computable Publishing LLC, and his nonprofit, the Scientific Knowledge Accelerator Foundation, Brian leads multiple efforts, including the Health Evidence Knowledge Accelerator, Evidence-Based Medicine on Fire Implementation Guide, the Scientific Evidence Code System, and the Fever platform that facilitates data exchange for scientific knowledge. So with that, let me hand it off then to Dr. Hongsermeier to kick us off. Tonya?
Thank you, Josh. I'm going to see if I can share my slides and you can let me know if it's working. Great to be here. Can you all see my slides? I'm going to go into presentation mode, so hopefully that works.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, it's a hard act to follow. That was an amazing panel earlier. Josh and the team asked me to just talk about what we're seeing with AI and its impact on the learning health systems, the opportunities and challenges. So as we've been talking about already, AI tools are already being pervasively used in healthcare, sanctioned or not. Predictive models have been around for a while. And now we have the ambient listening tools, in-basket response management, image interpretation, clinical decision support via chatbots and patient messaging engagement, wearables, and the like. And of course, the prior authorization and the revenue cycle is becoming a hot target for use of AI. And of course now clinical trials in precision medicine. So what's the driver? Well, in what we're seeing is just diminished healthcare capacity. We've got an aging population, and despite the fact that we spend 20% of our GDP on healthcare, we have a huge access issues, and part of it we think is because we've been in a payer-providers arms race for quite some time, and with all the quality measures and the revenue cycle impacts on the caregiving capacity, the hope is that AI will help us deliver better care more efficiently in the face of diminishing margins, declining access, and the continuous uncertainty that healthcare delivery systems are living under in order to operate in the way the business model works for healthcare today. What's interesting to us, and certainly what we're seeing, is that we can imagine a day where actually AI just creates a new version of the arms race. So we heard about ambient listening earlier this afternoon, and yet there could be a day where you've embedded your generative AI tool with the policies of all the payers, And the ambient listening is not just listening, but actually prompting the clinician. So, for example, if the AI solution sees that the patient has psoriasis and it knows that infliximab requires a data point such as body surface area affected by psoriasis in order to approve infliximab, you can imagine a lot of these policies, these prior authorization policies, like finding that we're way upstream into that ambient listening process and becoming an ambient interviewing uh, uh, prompt as well. So I think that we're going to just see just this massive impact on how clinicians engage with these solutions, but also how the clinician patient relationship evolves as it interfaces with all these knowledge-based tools that AI can bring to the point of care. So so there's challenges we typically see challenges on two fronts. One is in solution development, which is I'm going to talk about this slide, and the second is actually in deployment. So we heard a lot about that earlier in the earlier presentation, but we've already heard about the bias in the training data and the potential for data to be non-representative of the target audience or target patient for the solution. But there's also the potential conflict of interest in terms of profit being the bias driver, in terms of if an AI solution is being developed by a vendor that's got a profit motive in mind that may not really be serving the patient. And Ken Mandel I think this last week, published a nice article about that in the New England Journal of AI. You've got hallucination issues, you've got the lack of transparency and explainability, and the fact that the solutions can be an echo chamber of flawed data and flawed knowledge. When we think about fact extraction and how AI tools today are looking at fact extraction, we're seeing that the data that it's fact extracting from has its copy forward data, because we've been watching for 10 years tons of copy forward. And when that copy forward happens, it might be propagating incorrect data. And then the ability to temporally reason over the data and really create a real picture of not just the current state of the patient, but the trajectory of the patient. You've got reconciled data. So we've already seen that with reconciliation behavior, when patients move from one EHR instance to another, data flows, and it could be flawed data moving around and continuously being validated because clinicians are too busy to make sure that the reconciled data is accurate. And then you've got the flawed knowledge challenge, and it's difficult to train and mitigate these risks with human oversight. And we have the scenario of the autonomous AI potentially learning how to hack or program or even evade human oversight. So, and it's difficult to regulate what is really a fast-moving technology environment with AI now. So, and in the implementation side, what we're seeing is that the workflow integration is going to be challenging. In that, I mean, we've got thousands of vendors now chasing healthcare delivery systems with their AI solutions. And health systems have to grapple with how do we, and Julia talked about that earlier, how do we integrate this in a way that really is supportive of the care process. But the APIs for where you insert and how you insert with today's EHR are actually pretty limiting for really creating the kind of integration that will be helpful. And also the solutions behave differently than expected. So, and there's model drift, there's data drift, and there's potential for misuse. And we're seeing the real risk of the ineffective user education. So we get engaged a lot in AI governance support for our clients. And a lot of what we're seeing is that it requires a lot of investment to educate your clinician workforce and create a certain skepticism on the part of clinicians in terms of how they're interpreting or using these AI solutions. Reminding them not to put PHI, not just even in systems where you have a BAA, a business associate agreement in place with your vendor, but also You've got tools on the market now like open evidence that clinicians just can access, and making sure they understand to avoid putting PHI into those tools if they're using that to get guidance from those kinds of tools. And we're also making sure our health systems educate their clinicians that ultimately when they're just like today, if with regular rule-based systems, your BPAs, how you use up to date, et cetera. At the end of the day, the clinician's liable because this, as long as the system's just providing interpretation or guidance, but the clinician's ultimately responsible for how, whether or not they agree with that guidance, what they utilize for that guidance. So making sure they understand they're still ultimately liable and that they have to be concerned and skeptical about what kind of guidance they're receiving. The education investment is high. And Julia also has a very nice article out there about the limits of clinical vigilance that I think is really a great overview of some of those risks that need to be mitigated. And finally, I think there's a real equity challenge on the part of health systems to have the kind of AI expertise in-house that they can use to leverage for how they purpose AI solutions as well as how they deploy those. So, I think we've been hearing about this earlier, that governance is crucial and having a commitment to guiding principles is crucial. And we needed this even with our EHR deployments and how we deploy any solution, but it becomes a significant challenge with AI-based tools because I think the expertise required to figure out that you're really achieving your guiding principles is much higher, the bar. So ensuring multidisciplinary stakeholder engagement and making sure you've got clear accountability for who's accountable for what, explicit operationalization model, and a very strong end user education plan is really essential. But also having that expertise in order that when you're dedicating resources to evaluating, validating, testing, monitoring, and continuously evaluating and updating how you're using your AI tools, I think that the bar is higher, but the governance it is essential, and making the appropriate investments in having that expertise is going to be a big challenge. I think academic health systems are in general better positioned to make those investments. And I think as AI evolves, we're already seeing mass consolidation, particularly in rural hospitals needing, and this kind of process, it just is another driver for, I think, more consolidation in the healthcare delivery market. So this is just a drawing to consider that life cycle of acquisition and deployment, and in terms of developing these AI solutions. And it's going to be challenging to have the amount of investment it's going to be required to provide the kind of oversight and risk mitigation such that you can evaluate, the solution for its function, the training data representativeness, what's the provenance of the knowledge, and having oversight criteria and methodology defined for how you're going to do that evaluation, how you're going to do that monitoring, having the budget for the tools and the resources, as well as the user education and the ongoing vigilance it's going to take for how these solutions get selected, how they get deployed, and how they get adopted. So, and then when you're in deployment and you're scaling and you're rolling out, really being able to monitor for these challenges like model drift, data drift. But with all those investments made, there is that opportunity to speed your learning cycle, to speed your self-transformation and your self-improvement cycle because of the speed at which these kinds of solutions can help increase that velocity of learning that can happen. So this is Chuck Friedman's nice learning health system model. And I think that for this model, the AI journey is uniquely challenging because it raises challenges for how do we trace that provenance of the data and knowledge that's utilized by these generative tools to interpret. And so how can we actually interpret its behavior, and how do we trace what was the AI solution, what guidance was it offering at the point of care, and and to what extent it had that impact in the point of care. I think a lot of new solutions are emerging on the market to try to help us do that, but it's still going to be it's a big challenge today in terms of um, building the kind of learning that actually helps you as a health system understand how its AI solution is behaving and what kind of guidance it's offering at the point of care. So some of the interesting work that our company has been involved in, we have a team that's been working with collaborators and GenomeX to make genomic knowledge useful and computable. And it's the challenge here, and as you can look on the left side of this diagram, and there are a variety of knowledge sources that clinicians can use to leverage genomic data and knowledge to make clinical decisions about therapy as well as, for example, even clinical trial matching. And our team participated recently in building a proof of concept for how to painstakingly and manually curate a CQL knowledge base, embed that in a knowledge repository, and then reason over a genomic database that's got FHIR operation APIs in order to provide decision support for clinical trial matching. And today's clinicians have to spelunk into multiple databases in order to think about clinical trial matching and trying to figure out if their patient is appropriate for a trial. Similarly, for therapeutic decision making, there are all these knowledge bases. They're changing rapidly. The velocity of change in these knowledge bases is overwhelming. So, so we're exploring this question of, well, can we use generative AI solutions to both simplify and synthesize the knowledge from all these sources into, say, a genomic chat decision support tool. In this regard, but these are useful when clinicians have a question that they want an answer to, which is genomic chat. But the other scenario is actually using it to build biomedical computable rules. I mean, such that you could train this system with human oversight to generate rules that can be written into a rules repository for executable knowledge and scalable executable knowledge. So these are the kinds of things that we're exploring and that portend a lot of opportunity to deal with the challenge that the high velocity change that's happening with knowledge bases like genomic knowledge requires us to really explore and think about how to speed that data, that knowledge acquisition into these uh, computing environments that have to reason at high velocity change, and also the surveillance. When we think about the fact that the genomic knowledge is changing rapidly, and we're going to have to reanalyze variants, the patient test results, because the import of those variants is going to change rapidly. And then we're going to have to figure out which of those changes in the interpretation of the variant might actually require a change in management of the patient. So for clinicians, we worry about the burnout that we're already experiencing today, the knowledge overload, the data processing volume overload. And I think precision medicine is already significantly increasing that burden. And so we're excited about really exploring the possibility of utilizing these new generative AI tools to help us more efficiently manage these knowledge repositories. But at the same time, I think that the human oversight is going to be essential, and the expertise to know that the knowledge generated is accurate and current. It's going to be a continuous challenge. So I'll pause there. Thank you. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you, Tonya. Fantastic. Let's hand it over to Brian. Oops, Brian, you are on mute.
Oh, okay. I needed to get to the Zoom control to unmute. You should hear me now.
Loud and clear.
Okay, excellent. We've heard a lot throughout the conference so far regarding the challenges of AI, and I'm hoping we can spend some time to now focus on how AI and humans can work together to mobilize computable biomedical knowledge. Abel asked earlier, how does AI fit into FAIR? And tying this to MCBK's manifesto to achieve the FAIR principles, making CBK easily findable, universally accessible, highly interoperable, and readily reusable. I'm going to especially note it that readily reusable demands that the data is trustable, transparent, explainable, and reproducible. So we saw many developments regarding AI, and of course these continue. And I just wanted to note some recent ones late last month. The Guidelines International Network have published principles for use of AI in the health guideline enterprise. And Health Level 7 International, or HL7, has an AI focus team that is evaluating 28 different projects related to AI. Key of interest include Project 14, focusing on AI and the medical literature, how AI can interpret and translate the medical literature into intelligence. And Project 28, the most recent one, is focusing on AI transparency and how to use that in FHIR. So we've heard a lot of challenges, and I decided to recap the key challenges that Tonya presented. Some of these challenges, such as bias, training data not being representative, and AI producing hallucinations, really comes down to using the wrong data. Some of these challenges, the difficulty to train and mitigate the risks of flawed human validation, lack of transparency and explainability, and hacking by autonomous AI actively avoiding human oversight, are really methods of processing the data the wrong way. So whether we use the wrong data or process the data the wrong way, we then have the challenge of mass repetition of flawed data actually leads to greater confidence in the wrong answer. Garbage in, garbage out. So the answer to the life cycle of AI-generated knowledge, the universe of AI-interpreted evidence, and everything in between is clear communication. So what is communication between humans and AI? Do humans know what data the AI is using, or is it a black box? Does the AI know what data the humans want to be used, or is it just finding anything out there it thinks may relate? Do humans know how the AI is processing the data? The explainability. Does AI know how the humans want the data to be processed? If not, how can we expect to understand each other? So clear communication is the answer to the life cycle of AI-generated knowledge, the universe of AI-interpreted evidence, and everything in between. And it's really a common form to communicate these issues, or a common form to communicate what data is used and how the data is processed. So a common form means the form is human interpretable and machine interpretable. It is precise and unambiguous. So this clear communication, I will put to you that the FHIR evidence resource is the atomic answer to the life cycle of AI-generated knowledge, the universe of AI-interpreted evidence, and everything in between. So HL7, if you're not familiar, is a standards developing organization, and the HL7 FHIR standard is effectively the standard for health data exchange. At this point, FHIR stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. The resource is the digital object that gets shared throughout. In 2018, we started a project to extend the FHIR standard to evidence-based medicine knowledge assets. You'll hear this nicknamed EBM on FHIR. And the goal of EBM on FHIR is to provide interoperability standards for all those working with clinical research or evidence and recommendations for clinical care derived from that evidence. The evidence resource, a specific digital object for sharing data, is meant to provide a machine interpretable expression of an evidence concept. An evidence concept includes the variables, the population, the intervention, the outcomes, what the evidence is about, the statistics, the quantitative expression of that finding, and the certainty, the qualitative expression of how well can we trust these statistical findings. Here is a high-level view of the structure of the evidence resource. In brief, there's metadata, there's a human-readable summary, descriptions, assertions, and notes. There's a variable definition area with structured data of what the data is about. Synthesis type, study design are concepts for how the data is processed, and the statistic includes the quantitative findings plus structured data for how the data is processed, and then a certainty element for ratings about its trustability. So my approach to realizing the MCBK vision includes many collaborative efforts with overlapping groups. There's a nonprofit Scientific Knowledge Accelerator Foundation and an open virtual group, the Health Evidence Knowledge Accelerator. Within HL7, a formal project, the EBM on FHIR project, to advance this within these standards. And the Guidelines International Network is a nonprofit organization primarily of guideline developers, all overlapping and working together in many aspects across this. And for technical solutions, I've started a small company, Computable Publishing LLC, and we created the Fast Evidence Interoperability Resources, or Fever platform. In a brief view, we can go to fevir.net to access the Fever platform, learn about any of the Health Evidence Knowledge Accelerator activities, and create FHIR resources for scientific knowledge concepts, or convert data from many systems to that. We can convert from Medline, clinicaltrials.gov, Magic App, GradePro, and so on. Here's an example. We go to clinicaltrials.gov to Fever Converter, put in a clinicaltrials.gov identifier, and we get back a result in a research study resource. In this case, it generated 45 FHIR resources to fully represent this study. And here is a view of the research study viewer. This is a study of favipiravir compared to standard care, hospitalized patients with COVID. We see identifiers, status, subject, what it's about. We have all the areas here we can zoom in on. And if we scrolled through here and ultimately got to the results, we'd ultimately find an evidence viewer for a single piece of evidence, in this case, a count of how many patients had fever reduction on a certain amount on a certain day if they were in the drug group. And we see a sample size, the percentage is 60% in that group. We can see that same data as structured data in the JSON, and the statistic type is specifically coded, quantity is provided, the attribute estimate of percentage specifically coded with quantity in units, and so forth. So it can be very granular to say the same thing in structured data. So that shows how we can take these complex concepts and provide it in a reproducible, structured way that could be understood by humans and by machines. So where do we go from here across the Health Evidence Knowledge Accelerator? One of the things we are doing is getting ready to publish an article or submit an article for publication to introduce the Scientific Evidence Code System. a standard vocabulary or ontology with 486 terms now for study design, risk of bias, and statistics. We will be balloting the EBM on Fire implementation guide in May to get formal feedback on its structure, and the implementation guide has nearly 100 different profiles for different aspects of reporting scientific knowledge. We will be creating the standard for a research study data dictionary, or the code key for how to understand a research data set, making the data fair for research data sets. Facilitating clinical trial matching with structured approaches to eligibility criteria, measuring the rate of scientific knowledge transfer. It's been said it takes 17 years to get from the results of the research into clinical practice, but these are estimates from before the internet. So we were actually going to figure out how can we measure how long it takes to get from clinical trial results being available to being incorporated into guideline recommendations. Creating the computable publishing guideline digitizer to help guideline developers convert their unstructured guidelines into digital form, and testing the summary of net effect profile. How do we represent the balance of the benefits and harms for a given patient and their relative importance in structured form? So you put this all together, and he flung himself upon his horse and rode madly off in all directions. But we're really following up on all of these different areas. So with that, there's my email address and the website address if you have any questions. And hopefully we have ample time for discussion.
We do indeed. Thanks so much, Brian, and thank you, Tonya. Please all feel free to pose any questions, reactions, observations in the chat, and we'd be happy to forward those to our panelists. I'm happy to kind of get the ball rolling here. And one thing that's kind of that's standing out for me is in reverse order, thinking Brian's work in formalizing or structuring knowledge, and Tonya's work with implementing that knowledge effectively into clinical workflows. And I was wondering, from where you sit, where do you see the major gaps, perhaps, in taking the knowledge that's formalized by some of Brian's efforts, for example, and maybe putting it into practice from some of what Tonya and her team's work are doing? Any thoughts, reactions?
Lots of gaps. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I think one of the major gaps is just awareness and people stepping up to do it in the same way. Having a standard so everyone can do it in the same way ultimately makes it easier because you don't have to reinvent how to convert from one system to another over and over again. So if you have, 10 systems, and in each direction of conversion, that's 10 times 9 times 8 times 7, however many, that adds up to a big number of how many different converter tools you would need to create to speak to each other. Or you could have 10 tools that convert from those systems to the standard and 10 tools that convert from the standard to those systems. You only need 20 tools. It's much less work than every pairwise comparison. But all the system developers have to become aware of the standard, familiar with the standard, and start contributing to it to make sure it works for them to reach that vision.
Okay, are we ready for questions from the chat at all?
Sure, unless Tonya had a perspective that you wanted to share.
Well, I think where I see is in terms of the implementation science for really thinking about how to make inject the knowledge into workflow in a meaningful way, and all the issues that I spoke to earlier in terms of health systems having the resources and the expertise to evaluate and monitor these kinds of solutions. and make sure they're being used appropriately.
Fantastic.
All right.
If I might just take prerogative to ask one follow-up question on the expertise point, and I was wondering from Tonya and Brian where you sit, like what are you finding is the required or preferred skill sets for folks to engage in this space of computable biomedical knowledge, to contribute to your teams, to be effective contributors to these projects, or even from a customer's perspective, like where do they need to be in order to be effective partners in some of your efforts?
Well, at least what we've encountered is really health systems, particularly in the rural areas, or the ones that are not in major academic centers, being able to attract and find people to add to their teams who understand the risks and know how to mitigate those risks, and have the expertise to understand what it takes to evaluate these tools and in terms of their reliability and their performance against expectations. And then I think that more broadly, health systems that implement, traditional decision support and tools, they have at least some in-house expertise for training and rollout adoption and putting those governance guardrails in place, but having the actual expertise to really understand these AI solutions and understand how to evaluate and monitor them, I think is the biggest challenge right now. And I think that's going to grow.
Yeah, I'd say from my perspective, as we have teams working in so many different areas, the technical skills are different if you're dealing with terminology development, because we have to have a shared vocabulary, and it's very different than standard data model development for shared data model than user interface development for interactive systems, or API development when you're trying to communicate between systems. So the major skill sets I find most important are actually not the technical skills, but being collaborative, being open, not totally trying to push your one idea at the expense of what it takes to get shared understanding and work across the effort. And it's really about being team player skill sets, because this is a large team solution to make this work across many different teams and communities.
Fantastic. And thanks for being generous and allowing me that follow-up question. Noor, if I might look to you, are there questions that are arising in our chat that you'd like to share with our panelists?
Yep. So firstly from David, this is a question directed to Brian. Does your impressive tool use AI to do the conversion from external resource to the FHIR format, or is this all manually coded?
Right. So at the moment, it is manually coded. There's two methods in our current tool set. One is manual data entry, where we've created human-friendly interactive data entry forms. So you do not have to understand FHIR or JSON. You just fill in the data for the concepts that it's asking for, and it will convert it to the FHIR structures. And then the other is converter tools, where we have mapped the structures of other structured data to the FHIR form and then automatically do the conversion. So if you're developing an AI tool and your output is necessarily structured data, we may be able to facilitate how to get the results of that to the FHIR form, but we're not currently applying AI directly in the tools. And that at some point we'd like to do that and work with others, but our primary effort is defining the structure itself for how to facilitate interoperable data exchange.
A question from Todd. Are there guidelines for applying certainty to evidence? Is this intended to be a statistical measure? I'm asking to determine if my 0.6 is comparable to your 0.6.
Yes, there are multiple different systems for how to rate the certainty of evidence. One of the most common is called the grade approach, and that stands for something like grading recommendations and the determination of evidence. I'm not immediately remembering what the acronym stands for, but the grade approach to rating the certainty of evidence and the strength of recommendations is used by hundreds of organizations and has very structured approaches where you might consider the risk of bias of that evidence. You might consider the directness, how well it relates to your population of interest, the consistency of the evidence, the publication bias, and then ultimately come up with a certainty of evidence. It turns out one of the many developments within the Health Evidence Knowledge Accelerator is actually to define the grade ontology, where we take that certainty of evidence approach and give it standard agreed vocabulary that can be used both across human and machine systems.
Oh, wow. I see Nancy's hand up. Nancy.
Yes, before we move over to the poster sessions of the program, I'd like to ask Tonya and Brian the same question that we asked our academic panelists, which is, given how rapidly the external environment is changing right now and changes in federal funding that impact access to data and knowledge, what advice do you have for being agile in the face of these kinds of rapid changes?
For me, I mean, we're working with health systems, they're all grappling with these questions. And I think really thinking about firming up those guardrails, those internal guardrails and governance so that you can be agile in a safe way. I mean, you're going to have to be agile. We're drinking from an agility fire hose when you're investing in AI-based solutions. And so to me, it's really about having a strong internal governance and those guardrails and investing in those guardrails so that that agility, which is a mixture of what health systems aspire to be agile in terms of learning, but also a certain amount of agility is being foisted on health systems because of the fire hose of change coming at them.
Right. And I would say having successfully found sustainable, scalable funding for commercial solutions for big things in the past, and at the current state, I'm still trying to figure out how to make this one sustainable and supportable. But my general advice would be, it still comes down to the value proposition, and someone's paying you to do it. There has to be a value that they get. What are you giving in return? So if you're dependent on a government program that's not based on continued value, why they were paying, that's not a sustainable solution. So think about if there's enough of a value proposition to continue to get paid as politics shifts, someone should still find that valuable and pay for it.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one very quick question. Anything we can get under the wire, Noor?
Well, let me just double check here. Does the EBM on Fire IG have any integration with CDS hooks?
Not directly. The EBM on Fire IG deals with the structure of how the knowledge is represented, and CDS hooks deals with the interaction between, a request and a response in, matching, essentially getting data out of it. So the packet you get in a response from CDS hooks could include knowledge that is represented in the EBM on Fire structures, but because we're looking at different domains, there's not a direct interaction between the two systems.
Well, I just want to say thank you Tonya and Brian, so much for joining us today and sharing your perspectives. Very illuminating, and big round of applause to our speakers. Thank you so much. I think that concludes this panel, and let me hand it over to Nancy to take us to the next phase of today's program.